Evelyn Parker never imagined that a single letter could alter the course of her life so drastically. One day that crisp envelope promised salvation, a husband, a home on the sweeping plains of the West, and freedom from her stifling past in Philadelphia. But within weeks of arriving, her dream was shattered by her husband's brutal hand. Now, with bruises that never seem to fade and nightmares that rarely grant her peace, she makes a desperate choice run. The only person standing between her and certain doom is a Sioux man sworn to protect her. Their flight through the wild mountains will redefine loyalty, love, and destiny. Evelyn Parker's story began in the bustling heart of Philadelphia, a city humming with progress and possibility. Born to a modest family of bookbinders, she was taught early on that life offered no guarantees. Her father's failing health, her mother's tears in the still hours of night, and the constant threat of financial ruin weighed heavily on her. By the time she turned 20, she had lost both parents. Alone and penniless, Evelyn found herself drifting between menial jobs in a city that felt colder by the day. In that uncertain haze, an advertiser bullet changed everything wanted a good Christian woman for matrimony in the Western Territories. Intrigued by the promise of stability, a fresh start, and the chance to leave the painful memories behind, she answered the ad. Letters crisscrossed the country, full of polite queries, grand assurances, and the kind of sweet talk that made her believe in a gentle dream. The man on the other end, Jedediah Fowler, boasted of a generous homestead near the Black Hills. Though the region was at the time fraught with tension, trusting the power of these written vows, she agreed to marry him by proxy, a common arrangement for mail-order brides. So with her meager belongings packed into a single trunk, Evelyn embarked on the westbound train. Every turn of the wheels sang a chorus of excitement and trepidation, as the stifling heat of Philadelphia gave way to the dry winds of the plains. She rehearsed meeting Jed in her mind, his kind smile, the warm welcome to a cozy home, perhaps even a small orchard or garden. Instead, she found something much darker. If she'd known what horror awaited her, would she still have stepped onto that train? Destiny gave her no chance to reconsider. As the train slowed at a dusty frontier station, Evelyn Parker stepped down with her suitcase heart pounding. The wild openness of the West was a sharp contrast to the crowded streets of Philadelphia. She scanned the platform and saw a tall man with a worn hat and a stiff smile, Jedediah Fowler. "Miss Parker." "Yes," she answered, uncertain but polite. "Mrs. Fowler." "Now I reckon," he said, and shook her hand a little too firmly. He loaded her trunk onto a rattling buckboard and gestured for her to climb in. The ride to the homestead was quiet, with Jed offering only clipped remarks about cattle and dry weather. Evelyn forced small talk, but unease settled in her chest. Arriving at the property, her heart sank. The cabin was crude, the roof sagging, the fence broken. This wasn't the comfortable ranch the letters had promised. Inside it smelled of stale smoke and disuse. A single bed, a table, and little else. "Start supper," Jed muttered, then walked out. Alone, Evelyn unpacked, took stock of the meager supplies, and started a simple meal. That evening, they ate in silence. Though the sky outside was vast and beautiful, she already felt caged. Something in Jed's eyes unsettled her. Something cold, unreadable. She had traveled west for a new beginning. But as the wind scraped the shutters and night fell, Evelyn sensed she had stepped into something far more dangerous than loneliness. The day after her arrival, Evelyn woke early to the call of a lone crow perched near the roof. She rose from the bed, careful not to disturb Jed, who slept heavily sprawled across the thin mattress. Outside, the horizon glowed pink, and the air smelled of dew and fresh hay. Eager to prove her worth, she busied herself with chores. She patched the wobbly fence, attempting to keep the chicken coop secure. She drew water from the shallow well, struggling with the old wooden pump. She swept the cabin's dirt floor, wincing with each rasp of the broom's bristles. Soon her back ached, and her palms stung with fresh blisters. Late in the afternoon, she ventured inside to start preparing a simple supper of beans and salt pork. Jed returned from an outing he never specified where he went, and stood in the doorway, his eyes dark. He glanced at her attempts to tidy the place and let out a low grunt. It was neither approval nor disapproval, just a sound that betrayed no emotion. Days turned into a week of frigid politeness. Evelyn found herself constantly on edge. She learned to interpret Jed's moods by the tilt of his head, the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. Sometimes he'd come inside with dust on his boots and a scowl on his face and say nothing at all, simply glaring as though she had offended him by existing. One evening she asked softly, "Jed, would you like some coffee?" He snapped his gaze to her fury flaring in his eyes. "Stop your yapping. You're always fussing about something. Let a man do some and breathe." She swallowed her hurt and looked away, stirring the coffee pot over the fire. The next morning his anger had escalated without warning. He roared at her for leaving the cabin door ajar, claiming that the draft had caused the fire to go out. Before she could react, his hand lashed out, striking her cheek hard enough to send her stumbling back against the table. Plates clattered to the floor, and the world spun momentarily. Stunned, she pressed her palm to her stinging cheek. She tasted blood and felt dizzy. 1,000 thoughts crashed in her mind. How could he be so cruel so soon? Was this truly the man who wrote all those affectionate letters? "You worthless fool," he spat. "If you can't do your chores right, I'll teach you, and next time I won't be so gentle." Gentle. The word rang in her ears. Her heart pounded a frantic tempo, and tears burned her eyes. But she willed herself not to cry. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, she returned to the stove in silence, shoulders trembling. Over the next few days, Jed's violence continued to erupt unexpectedly. A missed spot on the floor, a pot that boiled over a miscalculated remark. Any trivial matter could provoke him. Each time he'd strike her or shove her, leaving fresh bruises on her arms, a cut on her lip, a deep ache in her ribs. By the end of the second week, she carried more bruises than she could count. She began sleeping with a knife hidden under her pillow, though she doubted she had the courage to use it against him. She'd stare at the darkness above, wondering if an escape was possible. But she had no money, nowhere to go, no kin or friend to whom she could run. Neighbors were few and far between, and from the bits she gleaned from Jed, they weren't exactly neighborly. In her rare, quiet moments, she relived her old life, the hum of Philadelphia's streets, her mother's gentle voice singing lullabies, the smell of fresh-bound books at her father's workshop. She whispered apologies to their memories, for she had left in search of something better, only to find this living nightmare. One afternoon, she stood at the window, a rag in hand, wiping away the layer of dust. Outside, the rolling plains stretched out into hazy distances. But from this vantage point, all she felt was emptiness. Abruptly, Jed's voice snapped her from her reverie. "Woman, if you're done daydreaming, bring me a drink." She turned stiffly, ignoring the pain in her side. She kept her face a careful mask. As she moved to fetch the water, a thought lodged firmly in her mind. One day, I must leave. No matter how, I must get away. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's desperation mounted. Each bruise, each cutting remark chipped away at her resolve until she moved like a ghost within the cabin. Often Jed would leave for stretches of time, presumably to check on neighbors' cattle or to gamble in the nearest town. He was vague about his whereabouts, and she dared not question him. She learned to welcome his absence, for at least she could breathe more freely, even if only for a day. It was during one of these lulls that the first spark of hope flickered into her life. A hot afternoon had drawn her outside, where she washed clothes in a big wooden tub by the side of the cabin. The sun beat mercilessly down on her shoulders, and sweat dripped from her temples as she scrubbed Jed's stained shirts. Suddenly she heard the creak of saddle leather and the soft thump of hooves. She tensed, expecting Jed to have returned early. But as she looked up, she saw a stranger on horseback. He was a young Sioux man, his black hair braided on each side. He wore a simple buckskin vest and trousers, along with moccasins that whispered against the dirt. Despite the scalding weather, he looked composed, his features calm. A rifle was sheathed against his horse's flank, but his hands were open and unthreatening. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. She'd heard rumors of Sioux raids, terrifying yarns of scalping and destruction. But as the man dismounted and gave a small nod, she realized he seemed nothing like the savage whispers. His voice when he spoke was quiet. Water, he asked, pointing at the well and then at himself. It was clear he was requesting permission. Her mind whirled. She should run inside and bolt the door, or at least fetch the rifle Jed kept on the mantel. But something about this visitor's manner dispelled her alarm. She offered a tentative nod. Yes, of course, she managed. He approached slowly, taking a tin cup from his saddlebag. Evelyn watched him lower the bucket, draw up fresh water, and fill the cup. He drank deeply, then paused as though savoring the relief. In the silence, she studied his face, sharp cheekbones, intelligent eyes. She realized she had never spoken to anyone from the Sioux Nation before. She only knew what newspapers and Jed told her. Neither source had seemed kind. When he finished drinking, he handed her the cup with a grateful tilt of his head. "My name, Chaska." He spoke carefully, as though testing each English word on his tongue. She accepted the cup and nodded. "I'm Evelyn." She glanced around, unease flickering in her chest. If Jed were to find this man here, how would he react? Jed's hatred for the Sioux was as vicious as his fists. Silence hung between them. Chaska looked at her bruised arms, the faint discolorations that ringed her wrists. A shadow crossed his features, and he lowered his gaze. He said nothing, but the gravity in his silence felt like 100 questions unspoken. She set the cup down, resisting the impulse to pull her sleeves lower. I should get back to the washing." But Chaska remained still. He touched the brim of his hair, a gesture almost like tipping a hat, then pointed southeast. "Fort Laramie," he said, naming the famous U.S. Army outpost that many travelers used as a waypoint. "You heard of it?" She nodded. "Yes, it's not too far, I suppose." She knew well enough that it was a few days' ride if one had a good horse. She'd read stories of the fort since childhood, how it served as a trading post along the Oregon Trail, then later turned into a military garrison. Why was he telling her this? He shrugged, as if explaining that was where he was headed or had come from. Then, without another word, he swung back onto his horse. Before he left, he offered her a long, searching look. Something passed between them, a shared understanding or curiosity. Then he nudged the horse, and within moments, he was gone. Evelyn remained by the tub, the midday sun pressing down on her. She felt both relieved and strangely bereft by the departure of her mysterious visitor. She returned to her scrubbing, her mind racing. For the first time since her arrival, she realized there were other people out here besides Jed people who might help her or at least see her plight. Days later, her arms still bore fresh bruises, her spirit teetering on the edge. She found herself thinking about Chaska, replaying the brief encounter, the kindness in his eyes. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but the possibility kindled a tiny spark in her heart, a glimmer of hope that she was not doomed to suffer in silence forever. Jed's rage exploded again, this time accusing Evelyn without reason of being unfaithful. Fueled by whiskey and paranoia, he struck her harder than ever before. That night, as he snored in a drunken stupor, Evelyn made a decision she had to escape, or she wouldn't survive. She retrieved a small tin box hidden beneath the floorboards. Her savings amounted to just a few coins, not enough for a horse, barely enough for food. Still, she began preparing. Each day she tucked away scraps of bread and jerky, a flask of water rope, and her small hunting knife. But she had no direction until Chaska returned. He came silently while Jed was away, and upon seeing her, bruises offered no words, only understanding. She pointed toward the horizon. "Fort Laramie," she whispered. He nodded and traced a rough map in the dirt away through the mountains. Before leaving, he handed her a pouch with dried buffalo meat and a carved stone talisman. She clutched it tightly, her voice trembling. "Thank you." That night, as the wind howled and Jed mumbled in his sleep, Evelyn packed her things. Her heart pounded as she whispered a promise into the dark. "I will not die here." Then, with only the stars above, and Chaska's guidance etched into memory, she slipped into the night toward the unknown and toward freedom. The plan took shape more quickly than she anticipated. One evening, when Jed left for a nearby settlement to see a man about some business, he promised he'd be back by dawn. Evelyn knew this was her best chance. He was likely off drinking or gambling. The night would be her ally, offering darkness to hide her tracks. She spent the afternoon trembling with anticipation, collecting every essential item. Her cloth sack held a few strips of jerked meat, a chunk of cornbread wrapped in paper, and Chaska's pouch of buffalo meat. She filled the tin flask at the well until it overflowed. She gathered her meager money, her hidden rope, and her knife. To her small pile, she added the stone talisman that Chaska had given her. She didn't entirely understand its meaning, but it felt protective, a link to something greater. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in blazing oranges and purples. Evelyn's heart thudded as she paced the cabin's single room, waiting for darkness. She left a half-hearted meal in the pot for Jed, hoping it would confuse him upon his return just long enough to buy her precious minutes. When the moon finally rose, she slipped out the door, her feet silent on the hard-packed earth. She paused, scanning the terrain. The night was still the distant cry of an owl echoing across the plains. A wave of fear nearly overwhelmed her. She was alone, untrained in wilderness survival, and at the mercy of every predator, human or otherwise. Yet staying was no longer an option. She followed the faint memory of Chaska's map. East-southeast. She set her sights on a distant stand of trees that looked like black pillars against the starry sky. Her plan was to reach that grove by morning, take shelter, and then continue through the mountainous trails by day's light. The first hour of walking was tense. Every sound made her start: the chirr of a cricket, the rustle of a small animal in the brush, the sighing wind. She fought the panic threatening to rise in her throat. "I can do this," she told herself. "I must." Around midnight, clouds drifted across the moon, plunging the world into near blackness. She fumbled her steps, snagging her dress on thorny undergrowth. Once she nearly fell into a shallow ravine, only stopping at the last second. Exhaustion weighed on her, and the pack on her back seemed to grow heavier. Finally, she reached the line of trees, half collapsing against a trunk. She pressed her forehead to the rough bark and struggled to catch her breath. The dryness of the air scorched her throat. She took a careful sip from the flask, aware that each drop was precious. She settled beneath the thickest branches, hoping they would hide her if anyone searched the plains by moonlight. Tying a piece of rope around a low-hanging branch and then around her waist, she fashioned a makeshift hammock that kept her a few inches off the ground. It was uncomfortable, but she felt marginally safer from prowling coyotes or snakes. Then she sank into a fitful doze, her entire body thrumming with adrenaline. Her nightmares were chaotic, a swirl of Jed's snarling face, the sting of his blows, and the memory of Philadelphia's busy streets, which seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. She woke multiple times to the rustle of leaves, only to realize it was the night breeze or a curious possum. Her heart galloped each time. When dawn finally painted the sky, Evelyn untied herself and dropped to the ground. She munched a small piece of cornbread, forcing it down her parched throat. She needed to push on quickly. Jed might discover her absence at any moment, and she knew he would be furious, determined, and probably armed. She struck out toward the rising sun. The terrain shifted from flat plains to rolling hills, scattered with rocky outcrops. Sagebrush gave way to stands of pine and juniper. She recalled the rough map Chaska drew, a winding passage through these hills that would eventually lead to a wider wagon trail. If she reached that route, she hoped to find friendlier faces. Still, dread gnawed at her. With each step, she felt Jed's presence looming, as if he might materialize from behind every boulder. Yet she also felt a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she was truly free. Free from his oppressive glare, from the constant fear of his fists. She clung to that thought, letting it guide her feet. By mid-morning, she was deep in the foothills, the sun warming her shoulders. She paused to catch her breath near a small creek where she refilled her flask. Kneeling at the water's edge, she allowed herself a brief moment of peace. The clear water babbled over pebbles, and small birds flitted among the branches overhead. She realized how starved she was for beauty, for simple kindness from the world. Her respite was cut short by a sudden prickle of unease. She rose and turned, scanning the trail she had just traversed. Had she heard a distant shout, or was it just the wind? Pulse pounding, she scrambled up a rocky ledge to peer across the valley. Nothing moved. But that didn't mean Jed wasn't out there, perhaps cursing her name rifle in hand. Fear gave her new strength. She hurried on, vowing not to stop again until she was miles farther. She whispered a silent prayer, whether to the Christian God of her childhood or the great spirit Chaska mentioned, she wasn't sure. Protect me. Protect me long enough to reach safety. By the time the sun hung high overhead, sweat drenched Evelyn's forehead and back. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The foothills around her had grown steeper, and she was forced to scramble over stony inclines. Each rock cut into her thin shoes, leaving her feet bruised and bleeding. But she pressed on, determined not to slow. Suddenly, as she rounded a bend, she nearly collided with a figure on horseback. Startled, she stumbled back, hand flying to the hunting knife at her belt. But she froze when she recognized the rider Chaska. Relief flooded her like a wave. He reined in his horse, dismounting swiftly. You need help," he said in halting English concern, shadowing his expression. She nodded, unable to form words. Somehow, in the midst of her terror and exhaustion, she had never truly believed she might see him again. Now here he was, the only soul who knew how desperate her situation was. Chaska studied the horizon behind her. "He comes?" he asked simply. Evelyn nodded again. "Eventually. He will." He seemed to understand. With a gesture, he invited her to mount the horse. She eyed the animal nervously. She had never ridden alone, but Chaska boosted her up, handing her the reins. He then took hold of a rope attached to the horse's bridle and began leading it on foot along a narrow trail through the hills. She clutched the reins, leaning forward. The horse's gentle sway was still alien to her, but infinitely better than continuing on foot. She opened her mouth to express her gratitude, but found her throat choked with emotion. Instead, she whispered a breathless, "Thank you." They continued for hours. Chaska guided them through hidden passes, the kind Evelyn would never have found on her own. He showed her which streams were safe to drink from, and pointed out plants that could be eaten for sustenance. Occasionally he would stop and place a hand on the ground, reading it for tracks. Once he spotted fresh horse prints that made his mouth tighten in concern. Jed, or perhaps someone else, was not far behind. By late afternoon, they reached a remote plateau overlooking a broad valley below. Pine trees offered shade, and a faint breeze cooled the sweat on Evelyn's brow. Chaska paused the horse and motioned for Evelyn to dismount. As she slid off her knees, nearly buckled. He steadied her, supporting her elbow. She slumped against a tree trunk, fighting tears of exhaustion. Chaska rummaged in his pack, producing a small pouch. He poured out dried berries and handed them to her. She ate greedily, savoring the tart sweetness. After she'd regained some composure, she watched Chaska gather pine needles and resin from a nearby tree. He crushed them in his hands, forming a salve-like substance, then gestured for her to sit. Carefully he removed her worn shoes and looked at her swollen, blistered feet. Without a word, he applied the pine resin to the cuts, his touch surprisingly gentle. A surge of gratitude welled up in her. Before she could stop herself, she spoke the words that had been echoing in her heart. "You saved my life." He gave a small shrug, but his eyes were warm. "You want to be free," he said. "Everyone should be free." She thought of the prejudice, the violence, the distrust that might have existed between a settler's wife and a Sioux man. Yet here they were, forging an alliance out of mutual respect and compassion. It astounded her how one's shared humanity could shine through the darkest circumstances. They spent the night on that plateau. Chaska built a small, smokeless fire to keep them warm. He also demonstrated how to spread pine branches for a makeshift bedding that offered insulation against the cold ground. Evelyn listened intently, her fear gradually giving way to awe and a strange comfort. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tug of hope. As darkness enveloped them, she mustered the courage to ask, "Why do you help me?" Chaska was silent for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, carefully choosing each word. "Soldiers, long ago, took much from my people. We help when we can." He paused, eyes glinting with memories. "I see you hurt. I cannot leave you." That answer stirred something deep in her, a sense of solidarity, of shared pain. She realized they were both survivors of cruelty, he from an oppressive system that had stolen land and lives. She from a cruel husband who believed he owned her. In that moment, she felt closer to him than to anyone else she had ever known. They sat by the small fire, the night sky a tapestry of stars overhead. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying faint echoes of distant wolves. Chaska spoke little, but his presence was calming. She felt protected in a way she never had with Jed. Still, a persistent worry gnawed at her heart. Jed was relentless. If he was indeed tracking her each day, brought him closer. She doubted he would give up easily. Tomorrow they would have to press on deeper into the rugged mountains. It would be a race against time and a battle for her very life. Morning brought a thin veil of fog rolling through the pines. Evelyn and Chaska woke early, packing up their modest camp. He helped her onto the horse once more, and they resumed their journey. The plan was to cross a narrow mountain pass that Chaska knew well, then descend into the next valley, where they could skirt around known settlements. From there, Fort Laramie would be within a few days' ride. The first hour was quiet, save for the horses' hooves clopping on the rocky ground. Birds chirped overhead, a stark contrast to Evelyn's pounding heart. She kept casting glances behind them, half expecting Jed to appear. Chaska remained vigilant, often pausing to listen or inspect tracks. A knot of tension coiled between her shoulders. As they rounded a sheer cliff face, Chaska suddenly halted. He raised a hand in a silent gesture to stop. Evelyn held her breath, following his gaze to a distant ridgeline. There, a figure on horseback lingered, silhouetted against the sky. Even at this distance, she recognized the posture, the broad hat. Jed. Evelyn's stomach turned to ice. Her hand instinctively went to the knife at her belt. She could see Jed scanning the horizon, pausing occasionally as if to gauge which way to proceed. The gap between them was still large, perhaps a mile or more, but the direction was unmistakable. He was on their trail, possibly drawn by the horses' tracks or the faint smoke from last night's fire. Chaska motioned for them to move quickly but silently. He steered the horse off the main path, weaving between dense stands of pine and boulders. The progress was slow, but it kept them out of Jed's direct line of sight. All the while, Evelyn's lungs burned from tension. She feared that at any moment a gunshot would echo through the hills. As the sun climbed higher, Chaska led them onto a treacherous slope, thick with scree and sliding gravel. He clucked softly to the horse, urging it to keep steady. Evelyn clung to the saddle horn, eyes wide. One misstep could send them tumbling down the rocky incline. Yet Chaska pressed on, determined to lose Jed in this labyrinth of stone and timber. They made decent progress until midday, when a sudden shout echoed from a nearby ridge. Evelyn's heart lurched. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Jed perched on a rock outcrop, rifle raised. The glint of metal in the sun stabbed fear straight into her core. "Stop right there, you harlot!" Jed's voice thundered across the chasm. "You can't hide from me." Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps. She expected a gunshot, but instead, Jed kicked his horse, plunging down a parallel route toward them. He aimed to close the distance, perhaps preferring to capture her alive rather than risk losing her to a stray bullet. Panic roiled in Evelyn's stomach. Chaska spurred the horse into motion, forging a path forward. The slope grew steeper. Rocks skittered under the horse's hooves, raising dust. Evelyn's mouth tasted of grit and fear. Behind them she heard Jed's curses, the crash of his horse breaking through underbrush. He was closing in. Time blurred into a frantic swirl of hooves dust and the thunder of her pulse. At last they reached a small plateau, but from here the path led to a dead-end cliff. She could see the drop-off, a sheer descent into a canyon below. Panic twisted in her chest. Were they trapped? Chaska swiftly dismounted, pulling Evelyn off the horse. He patted the animal's flank, whispering something in a language she didn't understand. Then he guided it to the side, out of direct view. Keeping low, he crawled to the cliff's edge, peering over. Evelyn joined him, though her knees shook so badly she could scarcely hold her position. The drop was terrifying, but below a narrow ledge angled down into a ravine. "We climb," he said, eyes flicking to her. Not safe with horse, she understood. The horse couldn't follow them on such a perilous path. They'd have to go on foot descending the rocky ledge. They had no time to debate. Jed's angry hollers drew closer. Clutching the rope she'd carried, Evelyn looped one end around an outcrop and tested its hold. Chaska grabbed onto the rope, eased himself over the side, and began guiding himself down the precarious slope. Evelyn's stomach churned with vertigo as she followed feet scrambling for any toehold. Gravel slipped beneath her, and more than once she thought she'd plummet. Her hands burned against the rope, and sweat stung her eyes. Halfway down, she dared a glance upward. Jed appeared at the edge of the plateau. His face was twisted in rage, and his rifle glinted. She braced for a shot, but it seemed the risk of hitting the rocks or losing the chance to reclaim her stayed his hand. Instead, he shouted obscenities, pacing along the cliff. They continued descending. At last, they reached a wider ledge. Chaska tugged her to a crouch behind a jutting boulder. They waited, breath coming in choked gasps. Above, Jed's curses reverberated. He fired a shot in frustration, the bullet whining off the rocks. Evelyn clapped a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. After a few tense minutes, Jed's voice receded, replaced by the rush of wind. He might have gone to find a different route down, or perhaps to fetch help, but for now they were free to move. Chaska motioned for them to continue along the ledge, deeper into the ravine. It took them the better part of the afternoon to navigate the perilous descent. By evening, they emerged at the base of the canyon, scratched and exhausted. The horse was gone, left behind. Yet they were alive, and for the moment out of Jed's line of fire. Evelyn felt tears of relief slip down her cheeks. Chaska gently took her hand, guiding her through the twilight. Exhaustion weighed on her, but she clung to his presence. Together they found a small cave tucked beneath an overhang of rock. It offered just enough shelter to curl up against the night's chill. Chaska gathered driftwood to form a tiny fire, carefully shielding the light from prying eyes. As the flames danced across the cave walls, Evelyn collapsed onto the rocky ground. She stared at the flickering shadows, her body aching. Despite the dire circumstances, a seed of determination pulsed in her chest. She would not go back. She would never again bow to Jed's cruelty. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she knew deep in her soul that freedom was worth every risk. Dawn broke over the canyon, the light creeping across the red-streaked walls like a silent tide. Evelyn woke stiff and sore, every muscle protesting. Her palms were raw from the rope. Her feet, despite Chaska's earlier care, ached with bruises, but she forced herself upright. They had to keep moving. Chaska was already awake, inspecting the mouth of the canyon. When he noticed her stirring, he offered a quick nod. He handed her a small portion of dried buffalo meat. She ate it in silence, tasting dust and exhaustion. Yet the simple meal gave her enough strength to stand. They pressed forward through the canyon, following a narrow creek. The walls towered on either side, funneling them deeper into a labyrinth of stone. At times they had to wade through frigid water or clamber over fallen boulders. Each step felt like progress, though the threat of Jed pursuing them still loomed. By midday, they emerged into a broader valley dotted with cottonwoods. The grass here was greener, and a shallow river glistened under the sun. Chaska signaled for them to pause, scooping water into his hands to drink. Evelyn followed suit, the cold liquid soothing her parched throat. Suddenly, a single gunshot echoed in the distance. Evelyn froze, heart hammering. Chaska tensed, scanning the terrain. The shot rang out again, closer this time. They scrambled into a patch of thick brush, crouching low. Through the foliage, Evelyn glimpsed movement figures on horseback. She counted at least 2, possibly 3. Were they bandits, or worse, Jed and reinforcements? One of the riders broke away, circling around. A second shot cracked, sending birds squawking into the sky. Adrenaline surged through Evelyn. She and Chaska exchanged a look. They had to move, or risk being cornered. They slipped from the brush, keeping low and using the terrain to shield themselves. The valley offered limited cover, so Chaska steered them toward a cluster of rocky outcrops on the far side. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Every time they heard the clop of hooves or a shouted voice, they ducked low, hearts pounding. At last they reached the outcrops, pressing their bodies against the stone. An agonizing moment passed before Chaska peered around the boulder. He gestured for Evelyn to look. She carefully leaned out to see a small posse of men in the distance. Jed was among them, his hat distinctive. He conversed with 2 rough-looking riders. One pointed to the canyon they had emerged from. Another pointed to the cluster of outcrops where they now hid. Fear twisted in her gut. They were being hunted like prey. A cold rage swept over her. She refused to be captured again, to endure Jed's brutality. She glanced at Chaska, who gripped his rifle. She could sense his readiness to fight if cornered. But the odds, 3 armed men on horseback versus 1 Sioux with a rifle and a battered woman with a knife, felt slim. Then fate intervened. A distant cry made the riders swivel in their saddles. Gunshots erupted from somewhere beyond the valley, followed by rowdy shouts. The posse hesitated, uncertain whether to pursue Evelyn or investigate this new threat. Jed barked curses, seemingly torn. After a tense exchange, they wheeled their horses and galloped off in the direction of the fresh commotion. Evelyn slumped against the rock hands, trembling. That random chaos, whoever or whatever caused it, had saved them. Chaska signaled that they should keep moving. With Jed temporarily diverted, they might gain enough distance to slip away. They trudged for hours, forging a path along the river. The vegetation thickened, concealing them. Occasionally, Chaska pointed to footprints or hoofprints near the water's edge. The land was not empty. They had to remain cautious. By late afternoon, exhaustion nearly toppled Evelyn. Her legs felt like lead, and her eyes drooped. Sensing her fatigue, Chaska guided them to a secluded hollow beneath a willow tree. He stood guard while she rested, leaning her back against the trunk. Sleep tugged at her, but nightmares of Jed's face haunted every attempt to doze. Eventually, Chaska shook her shoulder gently. She blinked awake to see the sun sinking. They had to continue under the cover of dusk. Pushing herself upright, she followed him along a narrow trail. A hush fell over the land, broken only by their soft footfalls. As darkness fell, they came upon a small clearing bathed in moonlight. Chaska halted. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small pipe. With a solemn expression, he showed it to Evelyn, then filled it with a bit of tobacco. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, he lit the pipe and drew in a slow breath, exhaling a thin stream of smoke towards the sky. After a moment, he offered it to her, a gesture of unity or ceremony. She hesitated, but accepted, mimicking his movements. She took a tiny puff, coughing at the harshness. Chaska didn't laugh. He merely nodded his gaze, proud and kind. In that moment, a profound sense of kinship welled up in Evelyn. They were two souls, flung together by fate, forging a bond in the shadow of life or death peril. She swallowed the tightness in her throat. She had no words in his language, and his English was sparse. Yet she felt they understood each other perfectly. They shared the pipe in silence, smoke curling upward like a fragile prayer. High above, countless stars shimmered. With each breath, Evelyn felt her fear recede, replaced by a fierce resolve. Jed might be out there thirsting for revenge. But she was no longer a cowering victim. She was a survivor, and she had an ally by her side, one who had risked his own safety to protect her. When the pipe was spent, Chaska gently touched the stone talisman around her neck. She had tied it there with a bit of twine, feeling its weight near her heart. "Keep safe," he whispered the most tender words she'd ever heard. She nodded, tears burning her eyes. Safe. Perhaps that was all she ever wanted. They rose before first light, guided by starlight toward what Chaska insisted was the final mountain barrier before the territory near Fort Laramie. Evelyn's muscles screamed, but she pressed on. Each step, each weary breath, brought her one measure closer to freedom. The path they followed wound up a steep slope strewn with loose rocks. As dawn streaked the sky pink, they crested a ridge. Below, a valley spread out, dotted with clusters of trees, and a ribbon of river winding through. Somewhere on the far side lay the wagon trail that led to Fort Laramie. Evelyn gazed down, tears prickling her eyes. It was beautiful, yet terrifying. "We're close," she asked, voice trembling. Chaska nodded. "Half day. Maybe." Relief and dread mingled in her chest. If Jed was still hunting, he'd expect her to head for Fort Laramie eventually. They had to be vigilant to the end. But the thought of a warm bunk of safety, of never feeling Jed's fist again, drove her onward. They began the descent, picking their way carefully. Midway down, a sudden flurry of movement caught her eye. She froze. Two riders emerged from a copse of trees, scanning the slope. Evelyn's heart leapt to her throat. They ducked behind a boulder, pressing themselves flat. The riders moved slowly as though searching. She recognized the shape of Jed's hat on one of them. The other, a wiry man with a scarred face, held a shotgun. They were no more than 50 yards away. Her stomach curled with terror. Chaska's gaze darted around, seeking an escape. The slope offered little cover, just a few rocks and sparse shrubs. If they stayed here, they'd be discovered. But if they moved, they might draw immediate fire. Jed's voice drifted up the slope, harsh and triumphant. "I know you're out here, Evelyn. You can't hide forever. Come on out, and I might spare your red skin friend. He's as good as dead otherwise." A sob caught in Evelyn's throat. She saw Chaska's expression harden. His rifle was clutched in his hands, knuckles white. She placed a trembling hand over his, trying to keep him from charging blindly. They had to think. The riders advanced slowly, weaving among the rocks. Scarred face spat tobacco juice on the ground, scanning the hillside. "Ain't nobody here." "Jed," he growled. "Maybe we lost 'em." Jed spat back, his tone venomous. "She's near. I feel it." They were only 30 yards now, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Evelyn looked around in desperation. Then she noticed a narrow crevice in the cliff face behind them. It led to a hidden shelf, an angle they might exploit. She tugged Chaska's sleeve, pointing silently. They crawled like insects, inch by painstaking inch, moving behind boulders whenever Jed or Sardface turned their way. The wind threatened to reveal them by shifting the dust around, but luck held. They slipped into the crevice hearts, thudding. Chaska pressed against the rough stone, gave Evelyn a meaningful look. He whispered so quietly she barely caught it. "I distract. You run?" Her eyes widened in horror. "No," she mouthed, shaking her head. She wouldn't abandon him to face 2 armed men alone. But he placed a hand gently against her cheek, as though to say this was the only way. Before she could protest further, he slipped out of the crevice rifle at the ready and fired a shot in the air. The sound ricocheted off the canyon walls. Instantly, Jed and Scarred Face whirled, guns raised. Chaska dashed behind a rock, drawing their attention away from the crevice. Evelyn's chest constricted as she realized what he'd done. He was luring them in the opposite direction so she could escape. Gunfire erupted. Bullets struck rocks with sharp pings. She heard Chaska's rifle bark in return. Unable to remain idle, Evelyn peeked from the crevice. She saw Jed dismount, creeping around a boulder with his rifle. Scarred Face circled wide, trying to flank Chaska. "No," she thought fiercely. "I won't let him die." Gritting her teeth, she clutched her hunting knife and scrambled over the rocky ledge, maneuvering behind Scarred Face. Adrenaline roared in her veins. She crept up each footstep, careful, the memory of Jed's brutality fueling her courage. Scarred Face raised his shotgun, aiming at Chaska's position. Evelyn pounced, plunging the knife into his back. He howled in agony, staggering forward. The shotgun blast went wide, gouging the ground. She tore the knife free, hands shaking as he collapsed with a gurgling moan. A wave of horror and sick exhilaration rippled through her. She had taken a life, or at least grievously wounded him. But there was no time for remorse. Jed roared in fury, charging toward her, the muzzle of his rifle leveled at her chest. Evelyn's mind screamed. She froze. Certain death was seconds away. But a thunderous crack echoed. Chaska's bullet struck Jed in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The rifle fired harmlessly into the air. Rage twisted Jed's features. Bleeding and snarling, he lifted the rifle again. Evelyn dove behind a rock. Another shot rang out. Chaska again, and this time Jed's scream tore the air. Evelyn risked a glance. Jed lay sprawled on the rocky ground, blood soaking his shirt. His rifle slipped from his grasp. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged pant of Evelyn's breath and the distant crow of a bird. Slowly, she edged closer to Jed, knife in hand. He stared at her eyes, wild with pain and hatred. Blood bubbled from his lips. She felt no triumph, only a profound exhaustion. Memories flashed his fist in her face, the bruises, the terror. But now he lay dying, and some part of her recoiled at the brutality. She swallowed hard. There was no doubt his wounds were fatal. He'd never lay a hand on her again. She stepped back, letting the knife slip from her fingers. Chaska appeared at her side, limping slightly, but alive. They shared a charged look. Then, without another word, they turned away from Jed's last rattling gasps. Evelyn's hands shook, and hot tears streaked her face. She had never wanted to kill anyone, but she wanted to live. And so did Chaska. Together they walked away, leaving Jed and Scarred Face behind, in a lonely stretch of wilderness that had claimed too many lives already. It took them until midday to find the wagon trail. A passing caravan of traders heading to Fort Laramie stared at the strange pair, a pale-faced woman with haunted eyes, and a Sioux man who bore stoic determination. They asked few questions but offered them a place by the fire and transport to the fort. As they rode with the caravan, Evelyn couldn't shake the numbness that settled over her. She had lost a piece of herself out there. Or perhaps she had found a new part, someone who refused to be a victim. She glanced at Chaska, their eyes meeting across the wagon bed. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. In that moment, she realized she wasn't alone. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms with the friend who had stood by her side when no one else would. The wagon creaked onward, each wheel turning as if heralding a new dawn. A life free from brutality and fear, shaped instead by survival courage and an unlikely bond that transcended the divides of race and circumstance. Fort Laramie rose from the plains like a battered sentinel, its walls a mix of aging timber and sun-baked adobe. Soldiers and traders mingled under the midday sun, the bustle of life sharply at odds with the lethal quiet of the surrounding wilderness. Evelyn and Chaska arrived with the traders, stirring curiosity among the fort's inhabitants. For Evelyn, the sudden noise and confusion felt overwhelming. She had grown accustomed to stealth, to the wilderness's hush, to the constant threat of pursuit. Now chaos enveloped her horses' whinnies, distant bugle calls, the murmur of negotiations in a dozen languages. But beneath her fatigue, she felt an undeniable wave of relief she was safely beyond Jed's reach. A sympathetic army surgeon cleaned and bandaged Chaska's wounds. Evelyn answered the few official questions about her husband's fate with trembling honesty. The officer took notes, nodded solemnly, and murmured something about frontier justice. In a place like this, her story was hardly shocking. Days passed, and her bruises slowly faded. She and Chaska found lodgings in a cramped bunkhouse near the fort's outer wall. Whispers followed them, some disapproving, some curious. Yet neither Evelyn nor Chaska cared to explain. They had survived together, bled together, and that was enough. One morning, Evelyn woke early, stepping outside to watch the sun crest the horizon over the untamed prairie. Chaska appeared beside her, silent as ever. She turned to him with a tentative smile. They hadn't mapped the future yet, but for the first time in her life, she felt the gentle glow of possibility. A future shaped by kindness, forged in the fires of hardship, and free from fear. Whatever lay ahead, she would choose it for herself. And she would never look back. Thank you for joining us on this wild, windswept adventure through the heart of the frontier. Evelyn Parker's brave flight from a brutal husband and her harrowing escape across the mountains, protected by the quiet strength of her Sioux ally, reminds us that courage can blossom in the darkest places. Their story shows that sometimes the most unbreakable bonds form between the unlikeliest of companions, and hope can flourish where fear once held sway. Now, if this epic tale of survival and redemption has touched you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button. Share this story with fellow Western enthusiasts and subscribe for more thrilling adventures and unforgettable characters from the pages of history and beyond. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and we can't wait to bring you more. Until next time, ride tall and stay free.